So I greet you all. This is teacher Dr. Mugomba Ronald, and today we are going to go ahead and look at the cardiac cycle. In the cardiac cycle, I am teacher Dr. Mugomba Ronald, MBCHB BSE Mark. We are going to go ahead and look at the cardiac cycle. We have specific objectives in the cardiac cycle that we are going to go ahead and look at. The first one, we are going to go ahead and list the phases of the cardiac cycle in the conservative order. We shall recognize that blood pressure changes determine valve action and direction of blood flow through the heart. We shall go ahead and explain the basis of arterial pulse and heart sounds. We shall go ahead and relate the ECG and the heart sounds to the events of the cardiac cycle. So basically, cardiac cycle is usually the series of events that take place between one heartbeat to the next heartbeat. So it is divided into what we call diastole and systole. As we are going to see, when you look at diastole means a period of relaxation when the myocardium of the heart is relaxing, whether it is the ventricles or the atria, the walls are relaxing. Then the period which involves contraction is known as systole. Now, when you look at the various stages that happen in the cardiac cycle, we are going to look at number one is what they call ventricular filling. That's what we are going to go ahead and look at first. So in ventricular filling, we have the rapid ventricular filling and also what we call the diastole vent filling. So we shall start with what they call rapid ventricular filling. Rapid ventricular filling, in some textbooks, you'll find it being called mid to late ventricular diastole. Mid to late ventricular diastole. This one here, usually the atria are usually in a relaxed state. The ventricles are usually relaxed. The semilunar valves are usually closed. Why are the semilunar valves closed? They are closed because previously we saw that the arterial pressure is relatively higher than the ventricular pressure. That is to say, the pressure in the aorta and the pulmonary artery is relatively higher than the pressure in the left ventricle and the right ventricle respectively. And then the AV valves are also closed. The atrioventricular valves are also closed. Now, then what happens thereafter is the fact that usually the AV valves open. When the AV valves open, then we shall see blood moving into the ventricles, whether the left ventricle or the right ventricle. So when they open with like this, then that marks the end of rapid filling of the heart. In fact, we usually see that 80% of the blood usually goes into the ventricle. The blood that goes into the ventricles, which is approximately 120 mils, it usually 80% of that blood usually goes into the ventricles during ventricular relaxation or diastole. Still, when you look at now the second part of ventricular filling, diastole, the atria are relaxed and the semilunar valves are still closed. The AV valves have opened. We have seen ventricles are relaxed, and we have seen blood entering into you can clearly see that blood is entering into the ventricles from the atria. So we go ahead and look at our next step, which is part C, and that one talks about atriosystole. Now, as I told you, that systole involves contraction of the myocardium. So now this time round we are looking at the atria contracting. So when the atria are contracting, a force is being exerted on the atria in this direction here. The atrial walls are contracting. The more they contract, they are going to contract and push blood from the atria into the ventricles. So the walls of the atria are contracting. The walls of the atria are contracting. contraction of the walls of the atria. What usually happens, the AV valves are still open. Why are they open? Simply because the pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the ventricles. The semilunar valves are still closed. The ventricles are still relaxed. That causes the 20% of the blood to also finally go into the ventricles. The 20% of the blood to also finally go into the ventricles. This atriosystole corresponds to, when you look at the ECG, it corresponds to what we call the P wave of the ECG. That is the P wave. When the atria are contracting, they correspond to the P wave. I've told you it is 20% of the ventricular filling. That is the last, when the atria are contracting, they just contribute to 20%. The 80% was already taken into the ventricles during diastole. Our second stage is what we call isovolumetric ventricular contraction. Now, when you look at isovolumetric ventricular contractions, we usually look at the ventricles are contracting. So now the wave of electrical excitation has spread into the ventricles. Now the myocardium of the ventricles is now depolarized, and when it gets depolarized, we start seeing them undergoing contraction. So when the ventricles start contracting, automatically we see the pressure in the ventricles starting to rise. When the pressure in the ventricles finally rises and exceeds the pressure in the atria, then what usually happens, blood tends to have an effect and it would love to backflow back into the atria. And that causes the snapping of the atrioventricular valves. That is to say, the mitral valves in the left atrioventricular orifices, or the tricuspid valves in the right atrioventricular orifice. So what usually happens is those valves snap and they close. When they close, as a result of contraction of the ventricles. But just remember, our semilunar valves are still closed. Why? Because the arterial pressure is still higher than the ventricular pressure. So when these valves close, they snap close. That produces our very fast, so we shall see blood being pushed, and the closure of those atrioventricular valves produces our very fast heart sound. That very heart sound is known as the lab sound. It is usually denoted as S1 on the phonocardiogram, and it is usually of a it is of a low frequency, and it takes a longer duration and a low pitch. Now, when you look at the ECG, this isovolumetric contraction of the ventricular myocardium is usually represented as the QRS complex, as we shall see. So the QRS complex is standing for the isovolumetric contraction of the ventricles. Now, so before we can go ahead and look at the ejection phase, I want to first go ahead and add on. When you look at the so that is still the semilunar valves are still closed, and no blood is leaving the ventricles during isovolumetric contractions. No blood is leaving the ventricles. All the valves are closed. The semilunar valves are closed, and the atrioventricular valves are closed also. That is why it is known as isovolumetric contraction, because there is no blood leaving the ventricles. Now, we go ahead and look at our next step, which is number 3, which is called the ejection phase. Now, this phase known as the ejection phase, sometimes it is known as the mid to late ventricular systole. Some books you'll find it being called the mid to late ventricular systole. In some books you'll find it being called ventricular ejection phase. Now, during this ventricular ejection phase, this is when we are seeing the ventricles ejecting blood into the aorta from the left ventricle and to the pulmonary artery from the right ventricle. So usually what we can see here, what we can talk about here is usually the semilunar valves open. Why do the semilunar valves open? Simply because now the pressure within the ventricles has now exceeded the pressure that is within the arteries, that is to say the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So then also we are seeing the AV valves are closed simply because usually we see the ventricular pressure is higher than that in the atria. So that is the ejection phase. Usually, this ejection phase allows blood to flow into the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Now, when you look at you can see blood flowing very clearly. So when you look at it on the ECG, it is registered as the QRS complex, which is corresponding to the wave of depolarization that is spreading through the ventricles. Now, after looking at the ejection phase, our next we can go ahead and look at so when blood is being ejected, what usually happens, we usually remain with what we call the end diastolic volume. That volume of blood that remains within the ventricles at the end of diastole. So that is what they call the end diastolic volume. So usually the volume of blood in the ventricles at the end of diastole, just before ventricular systole is started, that is what we call the end diastolic volume. And we said it is 80% of the blood that usually goes into the ventricles, 80% of the 120 mils. And then the ESV, what they usually call the end systolic volume, the volume of blood in the ventricles at the end of systole. Then we also have what we call the stroke volume. Now, what we call the stroke volume, this is the volume of blood ejected from the ventricles per single heartbeat. For every heartbeat, that volume of blood that is usually ejected out from the heart, that is what we usually call the stroke volume. And it is usually normally at rest. Most of the times in most individuals, it is an average of 70 mils at rest. So when you look at the end diastolic volume and you subtract the end systolic volume, you end up with what we call the stroke volume. So when you get end diastolic volume, subtract the end systolic volume, the blood that was pumped out, then subtract it from the blood that entered into the ventricles, what you remain with is what we call the stroke volume. As we are going to see, when you increase end diastolic volume, you usually also lead to an increase in systolic volume, or in the stroke volume, sorry. When you increase end diastolic volume, you will also have an increase in stroke volume. And when you reduce stroke volume, automatically you will also increase. When stroke volume has reduced, automatically you will have an increase in end systolic volume. So usually when the stroke volume, that blood that is pumped out of the heart, when it has been reduced, automatically what you remain with in the ventricles will automatically increase. That is what that equation is showing us. Now, there is another term that we also need to talk about, that is the ejection fraction. Now, that is simply the percentage of volume of blood which is usually ejected from that volume of blood that is usually ejected from the end diastolic volume, and it is usually given as a formula that ejection fraction equals to stroke volume divided by the end diastolic volume times 100. So usually, normally it is about 65%. So I would like to ask a question. What is the ejection fraction of a left ventricle with the EDV of 150 and the stroke volume of 75? Yes, what would you say? Okay. What would you say? Yes, I can see people already calculating and they have ended up with only 50%. Thank you so much for having calculated that. Good. So let us go back to our stages. By the time we ended, we were looking at mid to late ventricular systole, and we also which is sometimes known as the ejection phase. Now we are going to go ahead and look at the next stage, known as the isovolumetric or isometric ventricular relaxation. Now, during isovolumetric ventricular relaxation, as you can hear it is relaxation of the ventricles. when the ventricles start to relax, we usually see, so the ventricles, the myocardium of the ventricles is now relaxing. What usually happens as the myocardium of the ventricles begins to relax, what it causes usually the pressure that is within the ventricles to fall below the pressure that is within the great arteries, that is to say the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So as a result, this blood tends to have a tendency to fall back into the ventricles. So that need to fall back into the ventricles because of the negative pressure now in the ventricles causes the snapping and closure of the semilunar valves, that is to say the aortic valves and the pulmonary artery valves. So as a result, usually that causes the second heart sound, which is usually recorded as the double sound. Usually this double sound is usually denoted on the phonocardiogram as S2, and it has a very high frequency with a very short duration but a very high peak. So usually the atrioventricular valves are still closed, and usually we see relaxation of the ventricles. The ventricles are relaxing. So you can see them relaxing very well. So now finally, usually we see diastole. In summary, we have diastole. In diastole, we have isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. Then we have rapid ventricular feeding. Then we look at diastolysis, atrial contractions. During diastole, we have talked about this very well clearly. So now you can see during systole, we usually see isovolumetric ventricular contractions and ejection phase. That is what usually is in systole. So now when you go ahead and on approximation, usually the duration of a single cardiac cycle is we have usually diastole takes about 0.62 seconds, and systole usually takes about 0.3 seconds. So the longest is the diastole, and more time for filling of the ventricles. That is where we usually see 80% of blood going into the ventricles. Now, then we usually see more time for the relaxation of the coronary arteries. Now, we can go ahead and look at this relationship. So having looked at the whole events that take place in the cardiac cycle, allow me to go ahead and talk about the loop known as the pressure volume loop that is observed when we are looking at the cardiac cycle. Good. So when you look at the pressure volume loop, it is a plot that usually helps us to understand how the volume is varying and how the pressure varies with the volume in the different heart chambers. That is what we usually during cardiac cycle. So we have an A there, usually, as we are going to see. Now, during an A, that is when the mitral valves open. That is to say, the valves that are a junction, the atrioventricular valves on the left, they usually open during A. Why do they open during A? They open during A because we usually see diastolic refilling taking place. So diastolic refilling takes place when the mitral valves open, and that is all the atrioventricular valves. When they open, then we shall see filling of the ventricles with blood. So we usually see the volume slightly increasing. That is what we usually see, the volume which is usually slightly increasing. Now, when you look at B, we usually say, now finally, when the volume in the ventricles has increased, what we usually see, it has increased, but there is no significant increase in pressure. You can clearly see that when we are looking at this refilling, the period of refilling, we don't usually see much change in the pressure in the ventricles, though it is slight, it's just a slight change, but volume is rapidly changing, running from 50, which was our end systolic volume, end systolic volume, which was 50, and it is running to up to 120, which is our end diastolic volume. And that now refilling is marked, the period of refilling ends when the mitral valves close at B. So when finally they close, we go into a phase known as the isovolumetric contractions. Now, during isovolumetric contractions, as we talked about them earlier, we usually see the volume inside the ventricles is not changing that much, but the pressure is rapidly increasing, and you can see it clearly. That volume is fixed at 120, but the pressure is increasing drastically to approximately 80, and that will cause opening of the aortic valves. The aortic valves usually open. The semilunar valves, that is to the pulmonary artery valves and the aortic valves, they will open. Why do they open? They open simply because the ventricular pressure has exceeded the arterial pressure. Now, after there, when they are finally opened, that takes us to the period of ejection. Now, during the period of ejection, you can clearly see that the volume within the ventricles has started to decrease. So when the volume within the ventricles starts to decrease, we can see that finally the pressure also within the ventricles starts to decrease, as observed with the blue arrow. You can see clearly that now there is a period, that point D. At point D, we usually see the semilunar valves, or the aortic valves and the pulmonary artery valves, they close finally. So when they close finally, then the last phase is known as the isovolumetric relaxation. So during isovolumetric relaxation, usually as the ventricular walls are relaxing, what usually happens is the pressure that is within the ventricles rapidly falls as volume remains fixed at the end systolic volume. So that is what we usually call the graph that shows relationship between the volume and the pressure in the ventricles during the cardiac cycle. So that is usually what happens during the cardiac cycle. So you can see clearly that the end systolic volume is 50. The diastolic refilling, we have talked about it clearly. The stroke volume has been obtained very well. Remember, I said the stroke volume is a difference between the end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. The difference is the stroke volume. So usually, during cardiac cycle, the maximum right ventricular systole is, so you can try out that. That is your homework for you to try out. So I remain teacher Dr. Mgombo Ronald, and we have been looking at the cardiac cycle. We have been looking at the different events that take place in the cardiac cycle. This has been cardiac cycle part 1. When we meet again, we shall go ahead and look at the cardiac cycle part 2, where we shall look at the graphical representation of the different events that take place in the heart during the cardiac cycle. If you have really benefited from this video, I would like you to subscribe to the YouTube channel, share with your colleagues, comment in the comment section, and then like the video. Thank you so much. I remain teacher Dr. Mgombo Ronald, MBCHB, BSE Mark. Good time. Thank you.